At my daughter's wedding they laughed at me. They stopped when they learned I owned the company signing their paychecks. They didn't say it to my face, not directly. But I heard it, in the murmurs behind coffee cups and the sympathetic tilts of heads. 60 years old, divorced, laid off, well, her life is over now. That's what people whispered, as if they were standing over a casket instead of across the church parking lot. My casket. My life. My future. Buried neatly under their pity. I remember standing in the kitchen that spring morning, sunlight pouring through the lace curtains I'd hung back in the 80s. My divorce papers sat in a manila folder on the counter, as stiff and cold as the marriage that ended them. The layoff notice was tucked beneath, from a company I'd given 38 years of my life to. I thought maybe they'd give me a cake and a handshake on my retirement someday, but no. Just a sterile letter and a cardboard box with my things. The silence in that house was unbearable at first. You know, after decades of marriage, even the slamming of doors, the muttered complaints, and the snoring in the night, it all becomes a kind of rhythm. And when it's gone, the quiet feels like an alarm. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, not from noise but from the absence of it. That's when the voices of others started to creep in. Friends, neighbors, even my sister on the phone one evening, speaking with what she thought was kindness. "Maggie, honey, maybe it's time to slow down. Rest. Take up knitting. Or gardening. That's what women our age do." And then my daughter Alice. My only girl. She called one Sunday after church, her voice brisk, practical as always. "Mom, I worry about you. Why don't you find yourself a nice hobby? Knitting, maybe? Gardening? Something quiet. Nobody starts a business at your age." I can still hear the finality in her words. Like the gavel had come down. Case closed. I didn't argue. I just hummed my agreement, told her I'd think about it. But inside something flared. Defiance, maybe. Or stubbornness. The kind I'd always carried but rarely let loose. I wanted to ask her, "Do you think 60 is the grave? Do you think I'm finished just because I no longer have a husband or a desk to sit at?" But she wouldn't have understood. She would have shaken her head, laughed, and said, "Oh, Mom, you're being dramatic." So I stayed quiet. I nodded along. I even bought a pair of knitting needles and a skein of soft blue yarn from the craft store in town, just so she'd see them on my coffee table when she visited. I let her believe I was listening. But I wasn't. Every time I touched that yarn, I felt like I was holding resignation in my hands. And I was not ready to resign. I still had too much grit in me, too much left to prove. Not to the world, not even to Alice, but to myself. See, folks forget that women of my generation were born with a certain steel in their bones. We raised families on shoestring budgets, made dinners out of nothing but potatoes and hope, and still showed up to work at dawn the next morning. We were told to be quiet, polite, grateful, and when the world shut doors, we learned how to open windows. So when the whispers of my funeral reached my ears, I thought, fine. Let them bury me. Let them lay lilies on the coffin of what they think is my life. But watch me climb out of that grave with dirt under my fingernails and fire in my chest. That night, instead of knitting, I pulled out a notepad from the drawer and began scribbling ideas. Not dreams exactly, those were too fragile, too delicate. Plans. Calculations. Possibilities. I wrote down every scrap of knowledge I had gathered in all my years of work, about supply chains, manufacturing, the strengths and weaknesses of the companies I had known from the inside out. The truth is, I had always been fascinated by the bones of business, the way companies rose, stumbled, collapsed, and sometimes clawed their way back. I had spent years in boardrooms watching men in expensive suits make foolish choices, squandering resources, ignoring workers, bleeding once healthy firms dry. And I had thought to myself, if I were in charge, I'd do it differently. Well, now maybe I would be. Of course, no one knew this was stirring inside me. To them, I was just a woman licking her wounds, maybe shopping for rose bushes to plant in the backyard. I let them think that. I smiled politely at church socials, accepted casseroles from neighbors, and told Alice I was considering signing up for a knitting class at the rec center. But late at night, when the house was silent and the air was thick with possibility, I'd sit at that kitchen table with my pen and paper. And instead of knitting sweaters, I was knitting a plan. Instead of gardening, I was planting seeds of something else entirely. Looking back, I think that was the true funeral I attended. Not of my life, but of my obedience. The old Margaret, the one who lived quietly by the rules, who waited for permission and nodded at advice, she was gone. Buried. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. And God help anyone who tried to tell her no. If anyone had looked at me that summer, they might have thought I was living quietly, just as Alice suggested. My front porch had flower pots, my hands were busy with papers I tucked into folders, and there was a small basket of yarn sitting by my armchair for appearances. To the outside world, I was just another woman easing into her twilight years. But what I was really doing was gambling everything I had left. The seed money came from my savings, 40 years of careful work and a divorce settlement that wasn't much, but it was mine. I had never been frivolous. While other women my age bought timeshares or new cars, I had always tucked something away. My father used to say, "A dollar saved is a door unlatched." I suppose I was about to find out where those doors led. I filed the paperwork for my company quietly, without fanfare. No champagne, no big announcement, just me at the county clerk's office signing documents with a pen that trembled slightly in my hand. Not from doubt, but from the sheer thrill of it. The name I chose was plain, almost boring. North Star Holdings. It sounded solid, dependable, not like the stubborn gamble it really was. My plan was simple in theory, nearly impossible in practice. I would buy struggling medium-sized companies, manufacturers, service firms, businesses with good bones but bad leadership. I'd strip away the rot, rebuild what was worth saving, and make them profitable again. Now I had no illusions. I knew the risks. Most people my age were downsizing, cashing out, buying smaller homes or moving in with family. And here I was risking not only my money but my peace of mind. One bad deal and I could lose everything. But I couldn't shake the thought that maybe this was my one chance to finally do things my way. I started small. My first move was to buy out a tiny tool and die shop in Ohio that had been family-owned for 3 generations. The sons had no interest in running it, the father was too ill to continue, and the business was barely breathing. But I saw the value in its machines, in the loyal employees who still showed up even when paychecks were late, in the history etched into the worn factory floor. I flew out, walked the floor myself, asked the men questions nobody else bothered to. What would make your job easier? What do you need that you don't have? Their answers weren't fancy. A new drill press, better ventilation, someone who cared enough to listen. So I listened. I bought the company with nearly every penny I had saved, and for 6 months I lived like a college student again. Cheap meals, second-hand clothes, nights spent poring over balance sheets until my eyes blurred. I was no stranger to exhaustion, but I had never been exhausted for myself before. Always for family, always for someone else's paycheck, someone else's dream. Now, finally, I was wearing myself thin for mine. No one knew. Not Alice, not my friends from church, not even the ladies in my bridge group. They thought I was recovering from my divorce and my layoff. One neighbor stopped me at the grocery store, patted my hand and said, "It's nice you're slowing down, Margaret. You deserve the rest." I nodded, smiled, and thought about the contracts waiting for me back home. I didn't tell them because I knew how it would sound. Reckless, foolish, a recipe for disaster. They would have lined up with warnings and clucked tongues, telling me to be realistic. So I let them believe I was knitting sweaters when in reality, I was stitching together something much bigger. There were nights when I nearly broke under the weight of it. Nights when I sat alone at that kitchen table, head in my hands, wondering if Alice was right. If I was just chasing a midlife fantasy 20 years too late. But every time the doubt crept in, I pictured those men in Ohio, their tired faces, their calloused hands, the way hope flickered back into their eyes when someone finally said, "Yes, this place matters." That kept me going. By autumn, the little shop had turned a profit. Nothing grand, just enough to prove it could be done. I reinvested everything back into the company, then set my sights on the next. A cleaning service in Michigan. A small plastics plant in Pennsylvania. Slowly, carefully, I began to stitch my patchwork of struggling companies into something stronger. The paperwork piled up. My dining room became a war room of folders and ledgers. My calendar was full of flights and meetings I pretended were visits with old friends, whenever Alice asked. She believed me easily enough. After all, who would suspect their 60-year-old mother of running acquisitions across 3 states? It was a gamble, all of it. Every check I wrote felt like stepping off a cliff, praying the ground would rise up beneath me. But each time somehow it did. And the more it happened, the more my confidence grew. The truth is, I wasn't just chasing money. I was chasing dignity, proving to myself that I wasn't finished, that my life wasn't some funeral whispered over by neighbors and dismissed by my own daughter. And I swore to myself one day they would see. Not because I wanted their applause, but because I was tired of their silence. For now, though, it was my secret. My gamble. My quiet rebellion against the grave they had already dug for me. And I was just getting started. If the gamble was the spark, the climb was the fire. And Lord, did it burn. The first shop in Ohio had given me a taste of what was possible. It was like nursing a sick child back to health. Frightening, exhausting, but deeply satisfying when you finally saw color return to their cheeks. Once it found its footing, I realized I could do it again. And again. The second company I bought was a cleaning service in Michigan. A humble little outfit run by a weary widow who had lost her husband and her will to keep pushing against the tide. She looked at me across her kitchen table with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't keep this up, but I don't want to see it die." I promised her it wouldn't. And I kept that promise. I streamlined her operations, paid her loyal workers on time, and within a year, her little service was profitable again. But not every story was that neat. The plastics plant in Pennsylvania nearly broke me. It was drowning in debt, its equipment older than most of its workers, and its reputation blackened by late orders and shoddy quality. I spent weeks in a motel nearby, wearing the same 2 suits on rotation, rising before dawn and falling into bed long after midnight. I sat in union meetings that stretched for hours, faced down managers who rolled their eyes at the old lady with her bright ideas, and fought tooth and nail to win contracts that no one believed we could fulfill. There were nights in that motel when I cried into a pillow, my hands aching from flipping through endless ledgers, my stomach sick with fear. I'd ask myself, what if Alice was right? What if I've lost my mind? But every morning I put my feet on the floor and went back to that plant. I kept showing up. And eventually they began to believe me. When the first on-time order shipped out under our new system, the workers clapped in the break room. One of the older men said, "It's been years since I felt proud of this place." That was worth every sleepless night. 2 years went by in that rhythm. Ups and downs, wins and near disasters. I learned quickly that success isn't a straight climb. It's a staircase with broken steps, and sometimes you skin your knees on the way up. There were stumbles. A deal in Indiana collapsed when I discovered hidden debts at the last minute. Another venture in Illinois ate more cash than it returned, and I had to swallow my pride and shut it down. Those failures hurt, not just in the pocketbook but in the heart. Yet each mistake taught me something sharper than any textbook ever could. The thing that kept me going wasn't the numbers. It was the people. Everywhere I went, I met workers who had been forgotten. Men and women who kept showing up even when the paychecks came late, who still took pride in their craft when everyone else had written them off. I saw myself in them. And maybe that's why I fought so hard. By the end of that second year, I looked up from my stack of contracts and realized something astonishing. Northstar Holdings wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. My little portfolio of companies, stitched together from the bones of failure, was worth tens of millions. I sat alone in my kitchen the night I realized it, staring at the final numbers. The same kitchen where Alice once told me to take up knitting, where neighbors once patted my hand and told me to rest. I laughed out loud, not a bitter laugh, but the kind that bubbles up when you realize you've done something no one believed you could. Still, I kept it quiet. I didn't brag, didn't post announcements, didn't even share it with Alice. What was the point? They didn't listen when I spoke of my smaller dreams. Why would they listen now? I wasn't doing this for their applause. I was doing it to prove to myself most of all that 60 wasn't the grave. But late at night, when the house was still, I'd sometimes allow myself to imagine their faces if they knew. The shock, the disbelief, the scrambling to rewrite the story they'd already written about me. Not yet, I told myself. Let them think I'm knitting sweaters. Let them laugh quietly over my midlife crisis. The truth will come out when it must. And until then, I would keep climbing. There's a strange kind of power in keeping a secret. Not the shameful kind, the sort that gnaws at you. No, this was different. My secret was strength. A fortress I built brick by brick while the world thought I was knitting socks. By the third year, Northstar Holdings had become something formidable. I had a portfolio of companies across the Midwest, each one humming along, stronger than when I found it. The books showed numbers I'd never dared imagine. Tens of millions in assets. Contracts rolling in. Managers who shook my hand with respect instead of dismissal. And yet, at home I was invisible. At Sunday dinners, Alice would chatter about her work, about her fiancé, about the latest book club drama. I'd listen, nod, refill the gravy boat. Sometimes she'd pause, almost as if to ask me about myself, but the moment would pass and she'd dive into another story. If I mentioned something even slightly beyond her expectation of me, she'd wave it off. Once I tried. We were sitting at her kitchen table, steam rising from our tea. I said lightly, "I've been keeping busy with some new projects." She laughed, a kind laugh but dismissive. "Mom, your projects always end up with half-finished quilts in the closet. Why don't you just let yourself relax for once?" I didn't push. What would have been the point? She didn't mean harm, but she'd already written my story in her head. A tired woman knitting in the evenings, planting roses in the backyard. Nothing more, nothing less. So I let her think that. I smiled, folded my hands, and carried my empire in silence. Then came the wedding. Alice had been planning it for months. A grand affair with roses and string quartets, chandeliers dripping light onto polished floors. The kind of wedding a mother dreams her daughter might one day have. But with every detail came costs, and with costs came strain. One night, Alice sat at my kitchen table, her forehead creased. "Mom, we don't know how we're going to cover it all. Daniel's parents are helping, but..." She trailed off. "I just don't want to start our marriage in debt." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Don't worry about it, darling. I'll help." She blinked, surprised. "Help how?" "Half," I said simply. She gaped, then laughed. "Half? Mom, that's no, you don't need to." But I insisted. I wrote the check that night. She hugged me, tears in her eyes, whispering thank yous over and over. What she didn't do, what none of them did, was ask how. Not a single question about where the money came from. Not a hint of curiosity about how a woman they thought was scraping by could suddenly cover half of a lavish wedding. They simply assumed I'd emptied whatever savings I had, maybe even taken out a loan. And that stung more than I expected. Not because I wanted their admiration. Not even because I wanted credit. But because it told me what they truly thought of me. That I was the kind of woman who would bleed herself dry for them, quietly, without a word, and then return to her knitting basket with nothing left. I let it pass. For Alice's sake, for her happiness, I swallowed it down and smiled through the fittings and tastings, the endless chatter about flowers and fonts. I stood beside her in boutiques, watched her glow in lace and satin, and never once let slip that the woman footing half the bill was more than they believed. I was there, present, involved. Yet still I was hidden. There were moments during those preparations when I caught my reflection in the mirror beside her. She'd be standing tall, radiant in her gown, and behind her I'd see myself, smaller, softer, almost blending into the wallpaper. The mother, always supportive, never central. The one who paid, the one who smiled, the one who stood in the background. But inside I was more than they could fathom. Inside I carried the weight of boardrooms and balance sheets, contracts and negotiations. Inside I was a woman who could shift the fate of hundreds of workers with a signature. They didn't know. They didn't ask. And I didn't tell. On the morning of the wedding I slipped on my dress, navy blue silk, modest but elegant, and fastened the pearls I hadn't worn since my own wedding day decades before. As I looked in the mirror I whispered to myself, one day they'll see. But not today. Today belonged to Alice. Today I would remain hidden in plain sight, watching my daughter walk down the aisle, my secret safe behind my smile. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that it might always remain that way. The morning of Alice's wedding dawned soft and golden. The kind of September day when the air holds just a whisper of autumn, but the sun still clings to summer. I woke before the alarm, not from nerves but from habit. Years of early mornings had trained me too well. I moved slowly, careful with each step, as if the whole day were made of glass and I might shatter it with a wrong move. My dress hung waiting, navy silk that skimmed my shoulders, chosen after weeks of searching for something elegant but not ostentatious. On the vanity lay my mother's pearls, a gift on my own wedding day nearly 40 years ago. I fastened them around my neck, catching my reflection in the mirror. An old woman looked back at me, yes, but with eyes that had seen things no one here would ever imagine. When I arrived at the church, the sight stole my breath. White roses cascaded down the altar steps. Candles flickered in tall glass holders, and a string quartet played soft notes that drifted like whispers through the air. Guests filled the pews, laughter and perfume mingling, hats and suits pressed neat and proper. I sat near the front, proud but small, my hands folded in my lap. To anyone looking, I was just the mother of the bride. One more woman in pearls, smiling at her daughter's happiness. No one saw the weight I carried. No one saw the empire tucked neatly behind my calm expression. Alice looked radiant as she came down the aisle, her arm looped through Daniel's. My heart swelled seeing her like that. A vision of joy and nerves, cheeks glowing, eyes shining. I thought of the girl who used to play in my garden, her hands sticky with jam, her laughter echoing off the fences. And now here she was, a bride. My bride. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and rings and tears. The reception hall glittered with chandeliers, the tables dressed in linen and silver. The air buzzed with chatter and music, glasses clinking in toasts. I sat at my table, quietly proud, watching my daughter step into her new life. But pride has a way of carrying shadows. When the time came for speeches, Daniel went first, his voice trembling with emotion. Then Alice stood, her smile wide, her glass raised. The room hushed, everyone leaning forward to hear the bride. She began sweetly enough, thanking family, praising Daniel, sharing little stories of their courtship. People laughed, nodded, wiped at their eyes. And then she paused, glancing toward me with a playful grin. My mother, she said, voice light, thinks she became a businesswoman at 60. But we just call it her midlife crisis. Instead of knitting, she decided to play startups. The hall erupted. Laughter rolled like a wave, filling every corner. Forks clattered on plates, shoulders shook, hands slapped tables. I sat with a stony face, my glass untouched. On the outside, still as marble. Inside I was burning. The words seared me, not because they doubted my work, Lord knows I never expected them to understand, but because of the ease with which they dismissed me, the way they reduced my fire, my sweat, my grit, into a punchline at a wedding toast, I forced myself to breathe evenly, to sip my water with steady hands. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. As the laughter faded, the speeches rolled on, but something had shifted in the air. I could feel it pressing against me, the weight of being the joke in a room full of people who had no idea who I really was. I smiled politely, clapped at the right moments, even leaned in when the bridesmaids shared their little stories. But the flames inside me licked higher with every passing minute. And then fate, in its curious way, intervened. As I sat, turning my fork absently, a man approached my table. He was neatly dressed, polite, with the air of someone who had learned to tread carefully in rooms full of powerful people. He introduced himself as Daniel's manager, offered his congratulations, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked about my little work. For a heartbeat I considered brushing it off, playing the role they had written for me, the old woman dabbling at something harmless. But the fire inside me wouldn't allow it. So I answered, honestly, and I watched his eyes widen. He leaned down slightly, his glass in hand, smiling that polite, practiced smile managers always seem to wear. So, Mrs. Thompson, he said, formality dripping from his voice, Daniel tells me you've taken up a little project of your own. Something to keep busy? I could have nodded, given him the neat, simple answer everyone expected. Knitting, gardening, maybe a charity bake sale. I could have let him walk away believing I was the harmless joke Alice painted me to be. But I didn't. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye and said, I own North Star Holdings. For a moment he blinked, as if he hadn't heard me right. I'm sorry, what? North Star Holdings, I repeated calmly, evenly. We acquire and restore medium-sized companies. Manufacturing. Services. You may have heard of us. His smile faltered just slightly. His eyebrows knit together, and I saw his mind whirring, running through lists, connections, headlines. Then suddenly recognition dawned. His eyes widened, and the glass in his hand paused halfway to his lips. You. His voice dropped low, almost reverent. Your company bought out Midwest Logistics last spring. I nodded once. Yes. That was us. He nearly choked on his drink. Midwest Logistics wasn't just any company. It was the very network his firm relied on. The one he had mentioned in meetings as a major turning point for their contracts. I watched him struggle to compose himself. His polished manager's mask slipped for a moment, and beneath it I saw raw shock, even fear. He realized right there that the woman his boss's bride had just mocked from the stage was the same woman who signed the papers that now governed half his company's operations. You're that North Star? He asked carefully, as if afraid of the answer. I am North Star, I said simply. His mouth open, closed. He glanced around the room as though the chandeliers, the chatter, the tinkling piano could anchor him to something familiar. But nothing seemed steady anymore. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. For years I had been invisible to my own family. A fixture, a background character. And now here stood a man, younger than Alice, realizing I was not only visible but powerful. His voice trembled when he spoke again. Mrs. Thompson, it's an honor. Truly. I had no idea. Most people don't, I replied. And then I watched him straighten, look toward the stage where the speeches were still droning on, and something in his posture changed. He wasn't just speaking to me anymore. He was calculating. I could see the decision flicker across his face before he even moved. He set down his glass, excused himself politely, and walked with steady steps toward the stage. My heart gave a slow, heavy thud. I didn't know what he was about to do, but I knew one thing for certain. The little secret I had guarded so fiercely, The identity I had kept tucked beneath layers of modest smiles and quiet dinners was about to step out into the light. I sipped my water, my hand steady despite the storm inside me. All around, guests still laughed, clinked glasses, whispered over plates of salmon and potatoes. None of them noticed yet. None of them saw the shift that was coming. But I felt it in my bones. The room that had laughed at me minutes before was about to fall silent. And I was ready. The room was alive with clinking glasses and murmured conversations when Daniel's manager left my side and walked toward the stage. First, no one noticed. He moved with the calm assurance of a man used to being listened to, but in a room full of wedding laughter and champagne, he was just another dark suit weaving through tables. I knew better. I knew that he was carrying something now, a truth too heavy to be tucked back into silence. He reached the microphone and tapped it once politely. The chatter softened, then stilled. Guests turned their heads, expecting a harmless toast, perhaps another story about the bride and groom. Alice smiled from the head table, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, still flushed from her own speech. The manager lifted his glass. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady, smooth. "If I may, I'd like to say a few words. Not about the bride and groom, you've already heard plenty of those tonight, but about someone else in this room." A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. People leaned in, some smiling, ready for another joke, another light-hearted dig. My name was on their lips already, though none of them said it. The manager continued, "Earlier this evening, a little jest was made about a woman here. A joke about her so-called midlife crisis. About her dabbling in business instead of knitting or gardening." A few chuckles escaped, nervous and thin, but they died quickly under the weight of his tone. He wasn't joking. He drew a breath, then said clearly, "That woman, Mrs. Margaret Thompson, is not dabbling. She is not playing at business. She is the owner and founder of Northstar Holdings." The words struck like a stone in water. For a moment the room didn't move. Then whispers began, sharp as needles. Heads turned, eyes flicked to me, disbelief rippling like a wave. The manager's voice rose, firm and precise. "For those of you who don't know, Northstar Holdings is not a hobby. It is a corporation that, in the last 2 years, has acquired and restored multiple companies across the Midwest. Manufacturing, services, logistics. And when I say restored, I mean revitalized, saved jobs, brought businesses back from the brink." A few mouths fell open. A man at the table nearest me muttered, "Northstar?" as though he were testing the word for the first time. The manager's eyes swept the room. "In fact," he went on, "one of those companies, Midwest Logistics, was acquired by Northstar just this spring. That acquisition reshaped the very market many of us here work in. I can tell you personally, our own firm has been affected by it. And tonight, I find myself sitting across from the woman whose decisions guided that process." Gasps now, quiet but sharp. A bridesmaid pressed a hand to her mouth. A cousin frowned, trying to remember what he'd read in the paper months ago. And Alice, my Alice, stared at me with wide, pale eyes, her glass trembling slightly in her hand. Daniel looked stricken. His jaw tightened, his throat working as though he couldn't swallow. His manager's words were landing like blows he hadn't seen coming. The manager paused just long enough to let it sink in. Then he lifted his glass higher. His voice, clear as a bell, rang through the hall. "So let us be clear. This is not a midlife crisis. This is not a hobby. This is vision, determination, and success of the highest order. Mrs. Thompson is the owner of a corporation that shapes the livelihoods of hundreds of employees. She is a leader in her own right. And tonight, instead of laughter, I believe she deserves our respect. So I ask you all, raise your glasses. To Mrs. Thompson." He held his glass aloft, waiting. But no cheer followed. Instead, the room froze in a silence heavier than any words. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some lifted their glasses half-heartedly, others not at all. Eyes dropped to plates, to tablecloths, to hands folded too tightly in laps. The same people who had roared with laughter at Alice's joke now found themselves ashamed of their own voices. The silence pressed down on the room like a heavy curtain. It wasn't the comfortable hush of reverence. It was the uneasy quiet of people who'd been caught out, their laughter still echoing faintly in the corners of their minds. Forks hovered above plates, glasses remained lifted only halfway, and no one quite knew where to look. I felt it all wash over me. The shame, the doubt, the realization settling on each of their faces like dust after a collapse. For years I had been invisible, and in a single moment, their eyes finally turned toward me. Yet I knew that if I let this moment pass in silence, they would retreat back into their comfort, tuck this revelation into a corner of their memory, and carry on as though nothing had changed. So I rose. The chair scraped softly against the polished floor as I stood, and the sound alone made heads lift. Slowly, deliberately, I walked toward the center of the room. I didn't rush. Every step was measured, my hands steady at my sides, the pearls at my throat catching the light of the chandeliers. The manager stepped aside, offering me the microphone. I didn't take it. I didn't need it. My voice has never been the kind that needed machinery to carry. It has carried children through storms, workers through doubt, and myself through the long dark nights of loneliness. I let my eyes sweep the hall, meeting the gaze of those who dared to hold it. Some dropped theirs at once, shamefaced. Others blinked at me, startled, as though they had never truly seen me until now. "Yes," I said at last, my voice calm even. "What you've just heard is true. I am the owner of Northstar Holdings. For the past 2 years I have bought and restored companies that others had written off. I did not tell my family. I did not tell my friends. Not because I was ashamed, but because I did not want to burden them with my work. And perhaps," I paused, letting my eyes rest for a moment on Alice, "because I knew they were not ready to listen." A murmur passed through the crowd, low and uneasy. I drew a breath, my hands folded neatly in front of me. I kept silent tonight because this is my daughter's day, and I did not wish to take from her even a moment of joy. But I realize now that by staying silent, I allowed a different story to be told. A story that belittled not just me, but anyone who has ever been told their time is up. I let the words sink in, then continued firm and clear. Never let anyone devalue your dreams because of your age. Do not let them call it foolishness or crisis or a waste of time. If something burns inside you, it is not the fire of youth, it is the fire of life. And as long as you are breathing, you have the right to let it burn. A quiet ripple moved through the guests, someone shifting uncomfortably, someone else sighing softly. I saw older women straighten in their chairs, men furrowing their brows as though remembering their own discarded ambitions. I let my eyes return to Alice, my daughter. She sat stiff, pale, her hands clenched in her lap. Her mouth opened as though to speak, but no sound came. For the first time she seemed unsure. Not the confident bride, not the laughing daughter, but a woman realizing she did not know her mother as well as she thought. "I am proud of what I've built," I said gently, but with steel beneath the words. Not for the money, not for the recognition, but because I refuse to let myself be written off. Too many people my age are told to sit quietly, to fade, to vanish into hobbies and silence. I chose not to. I lifted my chin, steady and unflinching. And tonight I ask only this. When you speak of me, when you remember me, do not remember the joke. Remember the truth. For a moment the silence held thick, unbroken. Then came the applause. Soft at first, hesitant like rain tapping on a roof. But it grew, spreading through the hall, until it filled the air with something that was not quite celebration, not quite relief, something closer to respect. Not everyone clapped. Some sat frozen, guilt written across their faces. But enough did, and the sound reached me like a balm after years of quiet dismissal. I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then returned to my seat. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Alice stared at me, her face pale and drawn. Daniel's hand rested uselessly on hers, his own jaw tight with unease. Around us, the guests tried to carry on, the band striking up again, the waiters bringing out dessert, but the air had changed. The laughter was quieter now, subdued, as though people were afraid of what might be revealed in their next careless word. I sat my back straight, my heart calm. For the first time in years I felt truly visible. And though the night moved on, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The wedding carried on, though it felt as if the air had shifted. The music resumed, couples drifted onto the dance floor, and waiters balanced trays of coffee and cake. But beneath it all lingered the silence that had fallen after my words. It clung to the edges of the room like a shadow, softening every laugh, tempering every cheer. I sat at my table calm, almost still, sipping my coffee. My hands no longer trembled, though inside me something stirred. An odd mixture of triumph and sorrow. I had spoken my truth. I had been seen. Yet in the eyes of my daughter across the hall, I saw more confusion than pride. Her smile had gone brittle. Daniel avoided my gaze entirely. I thought perhaps that was the end of it. A single night of revelation, after which life would carry on in its usual rhythm, altered only by the weight of what had been said. But then the manager returned. He approached quietly, no champagne glass in hand this time, no polished performance for the crowd. His expression had changed. The earlier shock in his eyes had settled into something steadier, more thoughtful. He gestured toward a quieter corner of the hall. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" I nodded and followed him away from the music and chatter, past the tall windows where the moonlight spilled across the floor. We stopped near a side table, half hidden by a column of flowers. He cleared his throat, his voice low. "I owe you an apology. When I first approached you, I believed I was speaking to someone dabbling in nothing serious. I see now how wrong I was." I inclined my head. Apology accepted. But he didn't leave it there. He leaned in slightly, his tone shifting. "I'll be frank with you, Mrs. Thompson. Men in my position, executives, managers, we meet plenty of investors. They have money, yes, but no vision. They sit on boards and smile for photographs, but they don't have the backbone to make hard decisions. What you've built, that's different." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Different because you've taken companies people wrote off as dead and brought them back to life. That isn't just money. That's grit. That's judgment. That's leadership. And forgive me for saying so, but it's rare. Very rare." I folded my hands, waiting. I had been praised before, usually by those who wanted something. His words were flattering, yes, but I wasn't a woman to swoon over compliments. He must have sensed it because he straightened, more businesslike now. "I'll come to the point. Our firm has been looking for a partner. Someone who can do more than write checks. Someone who can see opportunity where others see loss. After tonight, I believe you may be that partner." For a moment I said nothing. My mind ran quick as water over stone. Here I was, in the corner of a wedding hall, being offered not flattery but opportunity. A chance to step even further into the world I had built for myself in secret. I met his eyes. "You want my money, then?" "No," he said firmly. "We want your mind. Your experience. Your courage to take risks others won't. Of course, your capital would be part of it, but what I'm proposing is more than investment. I'm proposing partnership." The word hung between us. Partnership. I thought of the nights spent bent over ledgers, the lonely hours in motel rooms, the exhaustion of carrying it all myself. And now here was a door opening, one I hadn't even considered. Still, I kept my voice steady. "You know, not long ago my own daughter told me no one starts a business at 60. That I should stick to knitting." He gave a faint smile. Then perhaps she's not the one you should be listening to. For the first time that night I felt a laugh rise in my chest, small, sharp, but real. I studied him, weighing his sincerity. He looked back at me with the eyes of a man who had seen enough boardrooms to recognize strength when it stood in front of him. And I realized then that humiliation, the joke at my expense, the laughter of the room, had led to this. A door I might never have found otherwise. Perhaps, I said slowly, we should speak again. Not here. Not tonight. But soon. His smile widened, professional but tinged with relief. I'll arrange it. He offered his hand, and I shook it firmly, feeling the weight of something new settling into place. When he walked away, I remained by the window for a moment, watching the moonlight silver the grass outside. My reflection in the glass stared back at me. An older woman, yes, but not diminished. Not discarded. A woman whose story had only just begun. Behind me, the laughter of the wedding swelled again, awkward but persistent, as if the guests were trying to patch over what had been torn open. I let it wash over me, unbothered now. Because I knew the truth. Sometimes humiliation is not an ending. Sometimes it is a doorway. And I had just stepped through. The wedding ended as weddings always do. Music fading, flowers wilting, guests drifting home with half-empty favors and tired smiles. But for me, the night never really ended. It followed me home, sat with me in the quiet of my kitchen, echoed in my daughter's pale face and in the silence that fell when the laughter stopped. In the days that followed, things shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, telling ways. Alice began to call more often. At first, her voice was awkward, halting. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" she'd ask, as though she were speaking to a stranger she wasn't sure how to approach. There were long pauses, moments when I could almost hear the word she wanted to say but couldn't quite bring herself to. Apology, admiration, maybe even regret. But instead she spoke of safe things, recipes, the weather, her honeymoon plans. Daniel was quieter. He avoided the topic entirely when we met again. His smile polite, careful, as though afraid of offending the very woman who could sign a paper that might change his professional life. His deference almost made me laugh. Only a week before, he'd toasted with ease while my daughter's joke made me the fool. Now he chose every word like a man stepping carefully through a minefield. As for the rest of the family, the cousins, the neighbors, the old friends who had always looked past me, they began to look at me differently. Not with warmth necessarily, but with a kind of cautious respect. Invitations arrived more quickly. Voices carried a little more reverence when they spoke my name. They no longer asked what I was doing with my time, as though assuming I was merely filling empty hours. They knew better now. And yet, for all the change in their behavior, what I valued most was what had changed in me. I no longer felt the need to hide behind knitting needles or flower pots for show. No longer tucked my contracts into folders the moment Alice walked in. No longer smoothed over conversations with vague half-truths. I didn't flaunt it, bragging has never been my way, but I no longer shrank either. If someone asked what I was doing, I told them plainly. I am building companies. I am creating jobs. I am leading. The words felt good in my mouth, not because they impressed others, but because they were mine. Still, Alice struggled. I could see it in her eyes whenever she looked at me, a war between pride and guilt. Pride that her mother was something more than she'd believed, and guilt that she had laughed, dismissed, made me small in front of so many. She never spoke it out loud, but a mother knows. A mother always knows. One afternoon, weeks after the wedding, she came to visit. We sat on my porch, coffee steaming in our cups, the autumn air crisp around us. She was quiet, thoughtful, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. Finally, she said, "Mom, I didn't know. I didn't understand." I reached over and touched her hand. "You weren't meant to," I said softly. "I didn't build this for applause, Alice. I built it because I wasn't ready to be finished. That's all." She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw tears shimmering in her eyes. But she blinked them away, swallowed hard, and changed the subject. Pride and guilt still tangled. It would take time. As for me, I had no regrets. That night at the wedding had been painful, yes. Being made a joke in front of family and friends cuts deeper than I care to admit. But it had also opened a door. The manager's offer still stood, and meetings were already being arranged. The portfolio I had built quietly in the shadows was about to step into the light, stronger and steadier than ever. And more than that, I had proven something. Not to Alice, not to the guests who lowered their eyes, not even to Daniel's manager. I had proven it to myself. I had proven that 60 is not the end. That age is not a grave. That a woman can rise from divorce, from loss, from whispers of her funeral, and build something greater than anyone imagined. I sat one evening at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once wept over layoff papers and scribbled my first shaky plans, and I smiled. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt alive, filled with possibility. I proved one thing, I whispered into the stillness. Never underestimate a woman who refuses to be written off. And with that, I closed my ledger for the night, poured myself a cup of tea, and let the peace settle over me. Because the truth was clear now. The best chapters of my life hadn't ended at 60. They had only just begun. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.